Welcome back to another video on hermeneutics as it applies to Christian unity. We've been discovering that the right principles or tools can help us better understand the Bible. Now, this provides a basis for having less disagreements on theology and on greater humility when we do disagree. We've looked at 8 challenges that can keep us from properly interpreting Scripture, and today we're going to look at 3 of the 7 principles that we should keep in mind while trying to understand this ancient text. Although the context will be a bit dry, or the content in this video and the next, please remember that these principles, they're super important to internalize to properly understand what the Bible is saying. So in Furr and Kossenberger's Inductive Bible Study book, they define hermeneutics like many others who teach on this topic from an evangelical perspective. They say that it's the science and art of biblical interpretation. Now they go on to say that as a science, there's a sensible principles to guide and direct our thinking as we interpret the Bible. As an art or skill, they note that hermeneutics provides us with a methodical process which is known as the inductive method. We're going to cover this in a later video, but inductive Bible study is a step-by-step process that has been widely accepted in Bible-believing circles as the most popular, most effective approach to the study of Scripture. In later videos, we're also going to cover how progressive Christians interact with the Bible. For now, let's focus on the 7 principles from the Inductive Bible Study book and summarize what they mean. Number 1, the literal or normative principle. It takes the words of the Bible at face value. Avoid reading into the text what is not there. The contextual principle. Always strive to understand the text within the confines of its historical, literary, and theological context. Number 3, the one meaning principle. There will normally only be one correct interpretation of a text, although there may be multiple applications. The exegetical principle. The meaning of any biblical text must be drawn from the text rather than ascribed to the text. The linguistic principle. The original languages of the Bible always take precedence over any given translation, even English. The progressive principle. Later revelation may clarify, complete, or supersede earlier revelation. And finally, number 7, the harmony principle. Any given portion of the Bible can have only that meaning which harmonizes with the Bible or the doctrine of the Bible as a whole. Now keep in mind that these principles have as a precondition the belief of inerrancy and inspiration of Scripture at some level. Now in later videos we're going to cover these 2 topics along with the different views that people have about them. Number 1, the normative principle. The term normally used for this is the literal principle. Now, I've moved away from this term because of the confusion that it brings with it. A lot of folks take issue with the literal, stating that it's silly to take every word literally in the Bible. However, that's not what theologians mean when they say to take the Bible literally. They fully recognize that there's figures of speech, there's allegory and metaphor within Scripture. Now, the truth is that we really don't have a good or a best English word that tries to accurately describe this concept. In the dictionary.com we see different definitions for the word literal. One is accordance with the strict meaning of the word or words, not figurative or metaphorical. This doesn't accurately reflect what this principle is trying to convey. Another is true to fact, not exaggerated, actual or factual. This is closer but still doesn't fully represent this principle either. That's why I'm going to use the term normative instead of literal and define the principle like this. To interpret Scripture in its normal, usual, ordinary sense unless Scripture dictates otherwise. Most of the time it's going to be intuitive to us when a figure of speech or metaphor is being used, as we all use these idiomatic expressions at times when we speak, and we usually recognize it when others use them as well. The key is to not allegorize the text or look for hidden meanings when the plain sense of the passage makes perfect sense. And when you do run across figures of speech in the text, you should still be looking for the literal intent behind the non-literal terminology. After all, the author's still trying to convey a message, even when using non-literal language, just like we do when we use figures of speech in our communication. So, when we read the hand of God, we know the author isn't speaking of a literal hand of God, but is using the figurative language to convey a message about God's power or sovereignty, for example. Number 2, the contextual principle. Now, this principle is possibly the most important principle of all. In fact, some even say that the 3 rules of interpretation are context, context, context. Furr and Kossenberger, they break it down into 3 parts. They say the historical, cultural context, the literary context, and the theological, canonical context. So the historical, cultural context is sometimes called the background context, and it's important to keep in mind that each book of the Bible was written by a human author who was anchored to a certain period in history and deeply tied to a particular culture, just like you or I are. When God inspired each author to write various portions of Scripture, He could have removed their words from the author's background, but He chose not to. Now, since this was important to God to utilize the author's historical, cultural context, it will also be important for us to understand their background properly, to properly interpret the message. Now, keep in mind also that a lot of the books are labeled as occasional documents. This means that the purpose for the particular book was often dictated by events in the author's time and culture that they are actually addressing. So the literary context has 2 components to it. The first is the surrounding context. Now, Furr and Kossenberger say that words, phrases, sentences, and even paragraphs may have multiple meanings, and these are almost always determined by what precedes and by what follows. Context of a given passage always determines the meaning of a given word. So, when studying the meaning of a particular word in the Bible, contextual meaning, i.e., what a word means in conjunction with adjacent words and phrases, will always take precedence over lexical meaning, i.e., a mere dictionary definition of a word apart from the specific context. The second component would be the literary genre or subgenre, as the Bible has many varieties of literary styles. Some of these would be narrative discourse, law, code, poetry, proverbial wisdom, gospel narratives, personal and corporate letters, etc. Almost every book in the Bible is not only written primarily in a specific genre, but also contains a lot of subgenres as well. The theological, canonical context is also important, but sometimes it's forgotten or ignored. Now, in the theological context, we see that expectations and requirements that God has for His people are at times different, based on various covenants He's had with humanity during different eras. Canonical context takes into account that each book must be considered within the entire scope of the other books of the Bible, remembering that each book will cohesively function with all the other books of the Bible to form one comprehensive book. The one meaning principle. This principle suggests any portion of Scripture can have only one correct interpretation. Now, some verses are vague enough that even when using good interpretive skills, a case could be made for either of several interpretations. Now, the one meaning principle would suggest that only one of them will be correct. And this is based on the notion of authorial intent. The human author had one thing in mind when he was writing that passage. This rule is sometimes broken, though, and to be too rigid with it is to paint yourself into a corner and possibly come up with an improper interpretation. One example is what's called sensus plenior or fuller sense prophecy. Sometimes Old Testament prophecy is cited as fulfilled by New Testament writers, which it doesn't sound much like the context of the original prophecy. Now, this would be attributed to the fact of dual authorship, meaning that God was also the author of all 66 books of the Bible, and His perspective was always much bigger than the human authors. Another reason to be flexible with the one meaning principle is that when using metaphor, an author can sometimes have more than one meaning. We would use the phrase a play on words, for instance, to describe this. Now still, the one meaning is a good principle, and the others should be exceptions to be on the lookout for. So that's it for this video. In the next one, we're going to cover the last four principles. See you soon.